Katherine Eban's Bottle of Lies could be described as the 21st century equivalent of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. If Sinclair's book exposed the horrors of the US meatpacking industry and led over a few years to reforms in the way this industry operated and the way it was supervised, it's too early to say whether Eban's book, which exposes the dark side of Indian pharma and the generic side of the pharmaceutical industry around the world, whether this book is going to have the same salutary effect. Joining me today to discuss her book is the author Katherine Eban. We're very happy to have you with us on The Wire today.
Thank you. Terrific to be here to chat with you.
Let me start with the title of the book, Bottle of Lies. Now, in the US edition, the subtitle was The Inside Story of the Generic Drug Boom. Here in India, it's Ranbaxy and the Dark Side of Indian Pharma. And now, obviously, the choice of title and subtitle, it's the marketing people in publishers who decide these things. But some feel that the original subtitle may have been too sweeping in its condemnation of generic drugs. And since this has been a major criticism leveled against your book by the government of India, for example, by Indian big pharma, let's get this elephant out of the room. Is Katherine Eban and her book against generic drugs?
Well, not only am I not against generic drugs, I take them myself. I mean, the entire US healthcare system is dependent on generic drugs, so we absolutely need them, and nowhere in my book do I ever propose getting rid of them. But, you know, in my reporting, what I did was simply follow the facts wherever they led me. And where they led me is to the conclusion that fraud is really endemic in the generic drug industry. And then there are larger questions about what, if anything, is the incentive for quality. But no, the only thing that I am partial to is the truth.
Right. But you are aware of the criticism leveled, say, by Indian companies that this is playing into the hands of global pharma majors who don't want cheaper drugs from countries like India to make inroads in their domestic markets.
I'm well aware of the criticisms. You know, what I would say to that is that the brand name companies are in many ways intertwined with the generic companies. They have generic subsidiaries, they're getting their active ingredient from India and China. So really, and I discuss several of the brand name companies in the book that have gotten into trouble. But it is not any particular animus against the generic drug industry whatsoever. Rather, I would say that the two are intertwined.
Right. Katherine, you've been here for a few days now in India. You must have seen reports of the government of India, the health ministry, and the Central Drug Standard Control Organization up in arms against what you've written. And there have been reports that the Drug Controller General of India and the and the CDSCO also want the government to take unspecified action against you. What have you heard so far from them, and what do you anticipate by way of the so-called action?
You know, I don't really know what to anticipate. You know, what I would say is that nobody has been able to point to anything in the book specifically that is inaccurate. Everything that I have reported on, there's 40 pages of endnotes. It's based on extensive documentation. So what that action would be about, I don't know, except some sort of action for exposing the truth.
In fact, when we saw the CDSCO response to your book and read it carefully, they suggested that the entire book was based only on interviews, which is clearly not the case. You have lots of documentation.
Yeah, I mean, and I have a reporting note in the book which specifies where I got the information, as well as, you know, dozens of pages of endnotes that clearly walks the reader through how I've sourced my material.
If there's a silver lining in what the health ministry said, their note to the CDSCO seemed to suggest that they should look into your allegations and make recommendations. Maybe they didn't anticipate this kind of a defensive pushback.
Right. I mean, you know, the question is, they're blaming the book, but what about what they're supposed to be doing, which is finding out whether drugs made by certain companies are substandard or not. So it seems to me that that should require more of their energy and attention than the allegations made in the book.
In fact, Dinesh Thakur who is the Ranbaxy whistleblower, figures prominently in your book, of course, but who first alerted many of us in India to this problem, and even people in the US, has narrated how many years ago he went to visit Harshvardhan, who was the government's health minister, and the chap was least interested in what Thakur had to say, continued watching TV throughout the time of the meeting, and then said, "You send it to me in writing and then I'll respond." And of course, no response was ever forthcoming. So it's a bit, I think that doesn't augur well for what exactly the government has in mind.
Right. You know, Dinesh Thakur has fought a very lonely battle in this country. I mean, he's been a relentless advocate for improving the quality of medicine. And, you know, I know that he's faced a lot of attack as well, but really what he's trying to do is safeguard drugs for the Indian public. So he should be, in my view, rewarded and praised for that rather than attacked.
Yeah, it's sad that even the Supreme Court didn't really give him much of a hearing when he tried to get the apex court interested in this. But I want to understand from you, what is it as a journalist, because that's your background, what is it that got you interested in reporting about the quality of Indian drugs to begin with? And was there a particular incident or anecdote that you encountered before that led you to want to undertake this enterprise?
Let me say that I never set out to investigate the Indian generic drug industry. In fact, I had no idea that that was behind what I was reporting on. I had gotten contacted in 2008 by a radio show host in the US. He does a show about pharma, and he said he'd been getting calls from listeners who were complaining about their generic drugs. And they were having side effects and relapses, and he took those complaints to the FDA, our regulator, and they basically said, well, it's probably psychosomatic, you know. If they're changed to a generic and the pill looks different, then they get upset. So Joe Graydon was his name, he didn't buy that, and he contacted me and said, you should look into this. So I really started just looking at patient complaints, and I began studying how the FDA approves generic drugs. But as I got deeper into it and I understood that 40% of the US generic drug supply comes from India, 80% of all the active ingredient in our drugs comes from India and China, and through that reporting and sources, it seemed clear that if I wanted to really understand what was happening with these generics, I needed to be looking at the industry overseas. And that is what led me to the story of Ranbaxy and more largely to the Indian generic drug industry.
Right. Now, the government of India has said in various ways that it's only a small percentage of medicines, generic drugs, that are not of standard quality. Now, so if malpractices are as widespread as you fear or as you allege, why is it that only a small, very small percentage of medicines, when they are tested, actually fail the test?
Well, actually, I think that the percentage is sizable. I mean, it certainly involves millions of pills, you know, and I think that there's probably very little measurement of how that is affecting patients here. But I think there is no question that the Indian market has a significant amount of substandard drugs. There is also no question that US patients have gotten substandard generics as well.
Now, since I'm not a specialist on this topic, as I told you, I took the liberty of crowdsourcing a few questions from friends, colleagues who know the subject better than me. And so two reporters, Anu Bhuyan and Priyanka Pula, who report on health, have been particularly helpful. So Anu, who has reported on health and medicine for The Wire, says that while The Bottle of Lies does talk about foreign drug regulators also being lax, and you document a lot of this, many have read your book to be unfairly slanted towards targeting Indian companies and not necessarily the foreign drug regulators and the foreign drug ecosystem within which these bad pharma companies flourish. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think that the book does examine the role of the Indian regulators, or rather the failure of regulation in India. I mean, you know, US companies also commit fraud and have wrongdoing, but one difference is the US companies fear the FDA. They fear their regulators, right? And they are subject to surprise inspections. So if you're going to be subject to a surprise inspection and you're fearful of your regulator, you would be more inclined to follow the rules. Whereas, all of my reporting here suggests that companies don't fear the regulator. They see them more as a partner, which I think is very problematic from a public health point of view.
But in terms of the fact, as you said, Indian generic manufacturers often get given a pass by, it took forever for the FDA to act on Thakur's complaints. So there's a sense in which even the global regulatory system isn't working.
It isn't working. And I would say, the book is highly critical of the US FDA. The 8 years they spent investigating Ranbaxy, all the while approving Ranbaxy's drugs, giving them the green light for the biggest generic drug launch in US history, generic Lipitor. Why? I think it's true. I think the global regulatory system is broken. There's no doubt about that.
Right. And Priyanka Pula, who's another health reporter, wanted me to raise with you the issue of whether the problem that you have uncovered through your visits and your research on India and China with generic drug manufacturers is actually part of a wider problem with the pharma industry as a whole, including with big pharma innovators who may falsify trial data or who may rush a drug to the market in the hope of getting high profits. Do you see that too as a problem? Is that an area that you may want to take your future research now that you're done with this?
There have been a lot of comments on social media. Well, if you're criticizing the generic industry, it's only fair that you also investigate big pharma. And in fact, I've spent years doing just that, exposing fraud in innovator companies.
Right.
One thing, though, that I've noticed, because the incentives are different, the fraud is also different. So it is not so much fraud in the laboratories of the innovator companies, it's fraud in the sales and marketing departments trying to expand the use of a drug.
Okay.
So,
so pushing it when it may not be necessary, perhaps.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So one key example of that, which has been devastating, was the company Purdue Pharma, which made OxyContin,
right,
and falsely pushed to expand the usage of that drug and hooked Americans
right,
on opioids. So, I've done a lot of reporting on those issues, but the fraud that I'm uncovering in the generic drug companies is fraud in the laboratories.
So it's shocking. Some of the things that
Yeah.
you've written about, the absence of actual testing equipment, the whole thing
Yeah.
being a fraud.
Yeah.
And you encountered this in your visits, and the
Yeah.
FDA also apparently came across many of these examples.
Oh, absolutely. And they're documented
Yeah.
in US FDA inspection reports.
So this brings me to Dinesh Thakur, because I also turned to him for whether he had any questions that he thought I might put to you. And so he was curious to know what your reporting says and your experience says about the U.S. Department of Justice and U.S. Attorney Rod Rosenstein, who oversaw the Ranbaxy case. What does it tell you that it took so long to prosecute the company despite the wrongdoing being so apparent? And how come the company's officers got off so lightly?
Well, to me, that is the critical issue, which is that no individual was ever prosecuted.
So Ranbaxy was
for
fine,
this.
and that was it.
Right.
Yeah.
The company pled guilty to 7 felonies, which is a big deal. But, there was no criminal prosecution of individual executives. And without that, it's very hard to really hold people accountable and to send a message through the industry that this behavior is not accepted.
Right. Now, Thakur says he's also disturbed by the fact that the FDA, even though it's documented instances of patent fraud or wrongdoing by many of these companies, continues to advise patients that they can carry on using medicines made by these companies. He wonders, as many others have, where accountability for public health lies in the United States then.
Absolutely. As long as I have been reporting on the FDA, which is now 2 decades, they are committed to not creating a public panic, to telling everybody that it's fine, and they barely even stop doing that when people are literally falling over dead. With the tainted heparin, with a number of cases in which they will almost never tell people to stop taking their medicine. It's very difficult to get them to do that.
In order to be fully FDA compliant, Indian companies have to put in place certain protocols, measures, safeguards in terms of manufacturing processes. This might actually end up increasing the cost of medicines within India to offset the increased requirements that the US may place. Is that a concern?
Well, first of all, they're supposed to be fully compliant. So that's sort of like saying if they actually follow the rules that they're supposed to follow, then Indian drug prices would increase. So the problem there is something called dual track production, which is that the generic companies make one level of quality for their export markets to Europe and the US, and they make another level of quality for rest of world markets, so that would be India, Africa, and unfortunately, they're just making the worst of the worst drugs.
But is that problematic to have different standards for different markets?
It's absolutely problematic.
Right.
I mean, as one executive described it to me, that's almost like a cancer that spreads throughout your organization if you begin to assume that it's okay to make a substandard drug for one set of humans, right? And a different quality for another set of humans. That is very eroding of...
Priyanka Pula also says that one of the arguments that is being made by people is that perhaps companies can make drugs that are less efficacious, which may then be cheaper and provide less bang for the buck, but are not harmful necessarily. Is this suggestion that some people are making a valid one?
Well, first of all, less efficacious is harmful, right? And it's harmful in a number of ways. One is it might not cure you, but another way is that it is actually leading to drug resistance. If you are underdosing a bacterial infection, then you are allowing the microbes to gain strength, right? Which is feeding into this drug resistance epidemic that is growing at a rapid clip. So I would argue that a little bad is very bad.
Finally, Dinesh Thakur wanted to know, based on your dealings with the DCGI in India, the Drug Controller General, how, looking forward, how optimistic are you that works like your book and other exposés which come to light will actually change the way in which the government and agencies and regulators in India function?
From what I can observe, it is only economic harm to the companies in India that will essentially lead the government to become better regulators. I don't see evidence right now that the Indian regulators feel compelled to act. And similarly in the US, the dynamic there is that only the US Congress is going to be able to compel the FDA to change how it regulates. Regulatory bodies are very sleepy animals, and they have to be frightened into working properly.
By the same token, Indian companies also have a self-interest in cleaning up their act. Yet, do you see much evidence of that happening?
Well, they absolutely do. You're right. I mean, in fact, there was just an article today about how India has gotten the most warning letters from the FDA of any other country most recently. So, they're facing the warning letters, import alerts. I mean, all of this harms the pocketbook, Yet, we've seen continued evidence of data fraud, fabrication, manipulation. So, it's a very entrenched set of behaviors, and it has to change.
Right. So it's clearly an uphill battle, but I think your book is the first salvo in what we hope will be a more concerted attack on lax regulatory practices that are actually extremely harmful for people's health. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Such a pleasure.
Thank you. Well, that wraps up this interview with Katherine Eban, author of Bottle of Lies. If you pop pills or take medicine, which I'm sure you do, or you know anybody who does, you definitely want to read this book. You want to absorb what it says, and I dare say it is likely to compel you to get very angry and to take action in some way or the other to put pressure on the government, put pressure on regulators to make sure that medicines produced in India are actually safe and deliver what they are supposed to do. Thank you for watching.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.